On April 16, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched one of the most massive military offensives in human history. Over 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and countless artillery pieces converged on Berlin, the heart of the German military apparatus. What happened next would determine not just the fate of a nation, but reshape the entire European continent forever. For 12 years, the German party had ruled with an iron fist, projecting an image of invincibility. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, had promised a 1,000-year Reich. But as Soviet forces closed in from the east and American forces advanced from the west, that 1,000-year dream was about to end in just 13 days of hell. This is the story of Berlin's final stand, a gripping account of how a mighty dictatorship collapsed, how a city was consumed by warfare, and how the world witnessed the ultimate downfall of one of history's most destructive regimes. It's a story of desperation, courage, betrayal, and the terrible price of totalitarian ambition. By early 1945, Germany's fate was sealed, though Hitler refused to acknowledge it. The Red Army had pushed deep into Poland. The Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany had already lost the war on every front, yet Hitler demanded his people fight to the last man, woman, and child. This wasn't strategy, it was delusion. The German military structure was crumbling. Officers who dared suggest surrender were executed. Soldiers were ordered to fight in hopeless positions. Hitler Youth members, some barely teenagers, were handed rifles and told to stop Soviet tanks. The regime that had once inspired terrified obedience was now holding together only through raw terror. When the Soviet cannons opened fire on April 16th, it was unlike anything Berlin had ever experienced. Over 40,000 artillery pieces, the greatest concentration of firepower ever assembled, pounded the German defenses. The sound was apocalyptic. The earth shook. Buildings collapsed. The sky turned orange with fire. The Soviets had learned from years of brutal warfare against the German military. They weren't interested in subtlety. They were interested in overwhelming force. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov commanded the operation with ruthless efficiency. His orders were clear: take Berlin, crush any resistance, and bring an end to the German dictatorship. The German defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. The Vistula-Oder offensive had already cost them hundreds of thousands of casualties. Their tank forces were depleted. Their air force was essentially non-existent. The Luftwaffe could barely get planes off the ground anymore. What remained was a desperate, makeshift force of veteran soldiers, young conscripts, and fanatics from the German party who still believed in miracle weapons and final victories. On April 20th, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the Führer bunker, a heavily fortified underground command center buried beneath Berlin. It would be his last birthday. While Soviet shells rained down above, Hitler sat with his staff and military commanders. Some urged him to escape. Some suggested negotiating with the Soviets. Hitler refused all of it. He would stay in Berlin. He would die in Berlin if necessary. By April 22nd, the Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin completely. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers now encircled the city. Hitler finally admitted what everyone else already knew: they could not win. But instead of ordering a surrender that might save lives, he demanded the city be defended to the last building, the last street, the last soldier. The urban warfare that followed was catastrophic. The Soviets didn't just want to capture Berlin, they wanted to destroy it, to erase the symbol of German power from the map. Soviet troops fought building by building, street by street, pushing deeper into the city. German defenders, many of them fanatics or forced conscripts, resisted ferociously, knowing what Soviet capture would mean for them. Berlin transformed into an apocalyptic hellscape. The beautiful boulevards where German party rallies had marched were now rubble-strewn battlefields. The iconic Brandenburg Gate stood amid ruins. Entire city blocks had been reduced to twisted metal and pulverized concrete. The civilian population, over 3 million people, huddled in shelters and basements, praying for the nightmare to end. The Soviets took brutal revenge for the suffering Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. An estimated 1,000,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed fighting Germany. Villages had been destroyed. Entire populations had been annihilated. Soviet soldiers advancing into Berlin carried that rage with them. War crimes were committed by both sides, though the systematic cruelty of the German party's invasion of the Soviet Union created a particularly vicious cycle of vengeance. Within Berlin itself, the government was literally tearing itself apart. Hitler, now a broken shell of a man, aged beyond his years by illness, amphetamine addiction, and the crushing weight of impending defeat, lurked in the bunker while his regime collapsed around him. He issued orders for non-existent divisions to counterattack. He ranted about betrayal. He demanded loyalty to the bitter end, even as some of his closest associates began looking for exits. On April 28th, Hitler heard news that shattered whatever remained of his mental state. Heinrich Himmler, one of his most trusted lieutenants and architect of the Holocaust, had been secretly negotiating with the Allies for a separate peace. Hitler, seething with fury and betrayal, ordered Himmler's execution. He promoted Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, to the role of chancellor. The German party was devouring itself. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, were closing in on the bunker itself. Soviet artillery was now firing directly into central Berlin. Casualties on both sides were staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians were dying in the final days of fighting. Yet still, Hitler refused to surrender. The German military continued fighting, not out of any belief in victory, but out of fear of their leader and the certainty that capture by the Soviets meant death or imprisonment. On April 29th, Hitler finally accepted the inevitable. He made his will, dictated his political testament, and prepared for the end. He blamed Jews for starting the war, even now, facing annihilation, unable to accept responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. He named Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and instructed him to continue the fight. In his final hours, Hitler was still delusional about Germany's prospects. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the final streets toward the Reichstag, the symbolic seat of German government, Hitler shot himself. His wife Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before in the bunker, died at his side by poison. They had ruled Germany for 12 years. That rule had brought death to over 70 million people worldwide. Now, in an underground bunker, with the sound of Soviet guns echoing above, it ended in a single gunshot and the fading light of torches. Following Hitler's instructions, his staff carried his body outside, doused it with gasoline, and set it ablaze. The dictator went to his death as his beloved Berlin burned around him. Soviet soldiers would arrive too late to capture him alive. He would die on his own terms, denying the Soviets their triumph of parading him before the world. But the fighting didn't stop with Hitler's death. The German party leadership was shattered, yet German soldiers continued to fight for 2 more days. Some didn't know Hitler was dead. Some didn't care. Some simply had no choice. Facing Soviet guns, they fought because the alternative was immediate execution or surrender to an enemy they believed would show them no mercy. On May 2nd, 1945, the commander of German forces in Berlin surrendered. Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reichstag, a photograph that would become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Berlin had fallen. Germany was defeated. The regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 13 years. It collapsed in 13 days of urban warfare that left much of Berlin in ruins and hundreds of thousands dead. The bunker where Hitler had spent his final days was entered by Soviet soldiers. They found the charred remains of his body, though the Soviets kept this discovery secret from the world for decades. They ransacked the bunker, searching for documents, searching for Hitler, searching for anything of value. The Soviet victory was total and absolute. In the days following Berlin's fall, German forces across Europe began surrendering en masse. The German party's unconditional surrender came on May 8, 1945, just 8 days after the fall of Berlin. The war in Europe was officially over. Germany, devastated and defeated, would be divided among the victorious powers. The fall of Berlin wasn't just a military victory. It was the end of an ideology that had consumed Europe and plunged the world into its darkest hour. The full horror of what the German party had done was only beginning to be understood. Concentration camps were being liberated, revealing industrial-scale mass murder on a scale that shocked even hardened soldiers. Berlin itself was left to rebuild from rubble. The city that had been the capital of German ambition was now a symbol of defeat. It would be divided into 4 occupation zones, and within a few years, it would be split by a wall, a physical representation of the Cold War divide between East and West. For nearly 30 years, Berlin would remain divided, a living memorial to the consequences of the war. The war had cost approximately 70 to 85 million lives when accounting for all theaters and the Holocaust. It had destroyed entire civilizations, displaced millions, and left scars that would take generations to heal. And it had all begun with the rise of an authoritarian regime that promised order and greatness through totalitarianism and violence. The fall of Berlin reminds us of several profound truths. Totalitarian regimes, no matter how powerful they appear, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. A government built on fear, violence, and lies cannot endure. And perhaps most importantly, the cost of such ambition is paid not just by soldiers, but by entire civilian populations caught in the machinery of war. Today the ruins have been rebuilt, but Berlin retains memorials to that terrible time. The city stands as a reminder that even the mightiest empires can collapse, that history can turn on individuals and decisions, and that the world must remain vigilant against the rise of authoritarian movements that promise easy solutions through hatred and force. The 1,000-year Reich lasted just 13 years. Its final chapter was written not in triumph, but in the smoking ruins of Berlin, a fitting monument to the ultimate futility of unchecked ambition and the indomitable human spirit that ultimately stands against tyranny. The fall of Berlin was humanity's painful but necessary victory over one of its darkest chapters. It was a terrible price, paid in blood and fire, but the world would never forget the lesson it taught. While the Soviet soldiers were still mopping up resistance in Berlin's streets, the search began for those who had orchestrated the regime's atrocities. The upper echelon of the German party wasn't simply gone with Hitler's death. Many of its architects had already fled, scattering across Europe and beyond, carrying secrets, documents, and in some cases, stolen wealth. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, and the man Hitler had briefly named Chancellor, didn't live long after the fall. In the bunker, facing imminent Soviet capture, Goebbels and his wife Magda made a fateful decision. They had 6 children, all of them born during the reign of the German party. Rather than allow them to fall into Soviet hands, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their children. Then they took their own lives. The propaganda machine that had manipulated an entire nation was silenced forever. Hermann Göring, once the most powerful military figure in the regime and head of the Luftwaffe, managed to flee Berlin. He would be captured later by American forces. During his trial at Nuremberg, he would sit in the courtroom, still defiant, still convinced of his own righteousness. He would eventually cheat the executioner by swallowing cyanide in his cell the night before his scheduled hanging. Albert Speer, the regime's chief architect and armaments minister, presented himself to the Allies as a man who had opposed the worst excesses of the regime. He would live longer than most of the others, telling his story to the world, writing memoirs, and shaping how subsequent generations understood the inner workings of the dictatorship. Whether he was a true penitent or a masterful manipulator remains a subject of historical debate to this day. But the most elusive figures were those who disappeared into the chaos of the final days. Some were captured years later. Others were never found. The full extent of what they had done, the systematic murder of millions, the enslavement of populations, the medical experiments conducted on human beings, was still being uncovered, even as the guns fell silent. Berlin's fall was militarily decisive, but the moral and historical reckoning was only just beginning. In the weeks after Berlin fell, journalists and researchers began interviewing survivors. Their accounts revealed the incredible diversity of human experience during those final apocalyptic days. There was the story of Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's secretaries, who had typed his final will in the bunker and lived to tell about it. There were stories of ordinary Berliners who had taken shelter in basements and emerged to find their entire city transformed into an alien landscape. A young boy named Peter Fechter would grow up in the divided city, eventually attempting to escape over the Berlin Wall in 1962. He would be shot by Soviet-influenced East German guards, and his death would become a powerful symbol of the ongoing division and repression that the fall of Berlin had led to. The fall of the original regime didn't mean the end of suffering. It merely transformed it into a different kind of conflict. The women of Berlin had endured particular horrors during the Soviet advance. Soviet soldiers, enraged by the German invasion of their homeland and the millions of Soviet women who had been raped and murdered by German troops, committed mass sexual violence against German women and girls. It's estimated that over 100,000 women were raped during the Soviet capture of the city. Many of these victims never spoke about what happened to them, carrying their trauma silently for the rest of their lives. Yet there were also stories of remarkable resistance and moral courage. Oskar Schindler, a businessman who had saved over 1,000 Jewish workers from being sent to death camps, had survived the war in Berlin. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, had used his position to provide Swedish protective papers to Hungarian Jews, saving thousands of lives. These were individuals who, faced with the machinery of the German Party's genocide, had chosen to resist. The Edelweiss Pirates, a group of working-class youth who had resisted the German Party's youth indoctrination programs through music, literature, and small acts of defiance, emerged from hiding as the city fell. They had spent years risking their lives for the simple act of being different, of thinking independently. Their story was largely forgotten in the immediate post-war years, but it represents an important truth. Even within a totalitarian state, resistance was possible for those brave enough to attempt it. In the immediate aftermath of Berlin's fall, one of the most pressing mysteries was the location of Adolf Hitler himself. The Soviets had recovered charred remains from the bunker, but they kept this information secret. For years, rumors circulated about Hitler's potential escape. Some claimed he had fled to Argentina. Others insisted he was hiding in remote parts of South America. These fantasies persisted for decades, fueled by declassified documents and conspiracy theories. The truth was less dramatic but more chilling. The Soviets had found the remains but deliberately withheld the information as part of their propaganda strategy. They wanted the world to believe Hitler might still be alive, somewhere, possibly in their territory, giving them leverage in the emerging Cold War. It wasn't until decades later that the full story of what happened to Hitler's body would be revealed. More immediately pressing was the hunt for thousands of other regime officials and soldiers. Many had fled to Eastern Europe, Austria, and beyond. The Allies established a systematic process to track down war criminals. Some were caught quickly. Others used forged documents and false identities to disappear into civilian populations. This led to a manhunt that would continue for years, even decades. Klaus Barbie, a Gestapo officer known for his torture and murder of prisoners, managed to escape and lived for years under a false identity in South America before eventually being tracked down and extradited to France for trial in 1983. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, escaped to Argentina and lived there for years before being captured by Israeli agents in 1960 in a daring operation. His subsequent trial in Jerusalem would become a major event in documenting the crimes of the German Party. The United Nations established the Nuremberg trials to prosecute the major war criminals. 24 of the highest-ranking figures of the German Party faced trial in an international court. It was the first major international war crimes tribunal in history. 11 were sentenced to death. Others received long prison sentences. Some escaped justice through suicide or disappearance. But the trials established a crucial precedent that leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, a principle that would influence international law for generations. The fall of Berlin didn't bring peace to the city. Instead, it brought partition. Within weeks, Berlin was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, Soviet, and French. What had been one city was now 4 separate administrations. The boundaries between these zones would soon become the fault lines of the Cold War. The tension between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies began almost immediately. Stalin, paranoid and ambitious, had no intention of allowing Eastern Europe to drift toward democracy or Western influence. The German party's defeat didn't end the international struggle for dominance. It merely transformed it into a different form of conflict. Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, became the symbolic battleground of this new struggle. In 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western powers out of Berlin by imposing a blockade. No supplies could enter the western sectors. The Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation to supply the city entirely by air. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew continuous missions dropping food, coal, and other supplies. Over 2 million tons of cargo was delivered by air. The blockade was eventually lifted, but the message was clear: Berlin would remain a flashpoint of Cold War tension. Then, in 1961, 13 years after the fall of the original regime, the Berlin Wall was constructed. The Soviet-controlled East German government, desperate to stop the exodus of its population fleeing to the west, literally divided the city in half with a concrete barrier. Families were separated overnight. People attempting to escape were shot. The wall became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the ideological divide that Hitler's regime had created the conditions for. The Berlin Wall would stand for 28 years. During that time, approximately 140 people were killed trying to escape. The wall came to symbolize not just the Cold War, but the price of totalitarianism and the desperation of people living under authoritarian regimes. When the wall finally fell in 1989, it represented not just the end of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, but the ultimate failure of the ideology and the systems that had succeeded the German party. Decades after the Soviet tanks had rolled through Berlin's streets, the world was still processing what had happened. The liberation of the concentration camps had revealed the true scope of the Holocaust. The photographs of emaciated prisoners, of mass graves, of the methodical machinery of death. These images shocked the conscience of humanity. Approximately 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered by the German party's regime. Millions of others, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, the disabled, homosexuals, had also been killed. Nuremberg was just the beginning of the reckoning. Over the following decades, other trials would take place across Europe. West Germany itself conducted thousands of trials of lower-ranking officials and perpetrators. The Eastern Bloc did less to prosecute its own perpetrators, many of whom were integrated into the Soviet-controlled governments. This created a festering wound in the historical record that wouldn't fully be addressed until after the Cold War ended. The Holocaust survivors carried their trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Many experienced nightmares, health problems, and psychological suffering for decades. They wrote memoirs, gave testimony, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the world never forgot what had happened. Their courage in bearing witness became perhaps the most important defense against historical revisionism and denial. But the reckoning wasn't limited to legal proceedings and testimony. It was also cultural and psychological. Germany itself had to reckon with its past in a way that other defeated nations had never had to do. A new German identity had to be built on the foundation of confronting and acknowledging the horrors of the Nazi era. This process, known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally coping with the past, became a defining characteristic of post-war German society. The debate about responsibility extended beyond the regime's leadership to complicit institutions, businesses, and individuals. Which companies had benefited from slave labor? Which institutions had collaborated with the regime? How much responsibility did ordinary Germans bear for what had happened? These uncomfortable questions would fuel academic study and public debate for generations. The fall of Berlin forced humanity to ask difficult questions about collective responsibility and the nature of totalitarianism itself.